Well, I've got 11:02, so why don't we commence? Welcome everyone to our first teachingamericanhistory.org Saturday webinar of the new academic year. These Saturday webinars are sponsored by the Ashbrook Center at Ashland University. TAH.org is the leading online resource for documents-based study of American history, government, and civics for teachers, students, and citizens. I'm Chris Burkett. I teach political science and history, and I'm also co-chair of the Master of Arts in American History and Government program at Ashland University. And happy to be back for another round of lively, hopefully informative webinars with some thoughtful scholars. The theme of this year's webinar series is moments of crisis. Some of you may be joining us for the first time. The point of these webinars is, as I just mentioned, to have an interesting, lively conversation with some thoughtful scholars about this year 10 important moments in U.S. history that really tested our mettle, I would say, as a people. We encourage all of you to participate in that conversation by submitting questions in the chat box, which should be down to your lower right. And as always, we will try to get to as many of those questions as possible. In the next week, you'll receive an email with a link by which you can request certificate of participation. And you'll also receive a link to the archived video and audio from our webinar today. Excuse me. So again, the topic for the first webinar, today's topic, is the Intolerable Acts. And I'm very happy to say we've got two very thoughtful scholars here to help us think about this moment in U.S. history. We have Todd Estes of Oakland University and Sarah Morgan Smith, who does a lot of work for Ashbrook and is also postdoctoral research associate at Princeton University. Good morning to you both, and thanks for being here this morning.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
Good. Well, I'm happy to be here too, because I've been waiting since May, I think was our last webinar of the last series, and I always learn a lot from these. So why don't we, if you don't mind, maybe as a way to get into this, feel free, of course, to take this any direction you want, but maybe as a way to get into this, I guess I've always been kind of curious about why. I know why they're called the Intolerable Acts, and I know the British didn't call them the Intolerable Acts. I've always just sort of been curious about how they came to be known as the Intolerable Acts, and perhaps how quickly that became the sort of universal, or at least the American way, the sort of universal American way for talking about these things. Why are they in the Intolerable Acts? Maybe we'll just start with a big question, if anybody wants to start with that. Or if not, you can go any way you want with it. Please.
Well, I'll just jump in. Sarah may know the exact date of when this happened, if there is an exact date, but I think very quickly after the news of these acts came to the colonists, they began to think of them as the Intolerable Acts, because they really believed that these were the kinds of things that were so fundamental in restricting liberties and practices that the colonists were used to and believed were theirs by right, that to submit to these would be basically to forfeit any rights as citizens, as people, as men. And I think they consider that to be absolutely intolerable. And I think when you take these acts, the Coercive Acts, as the British called them, and add to that the Quebec Act, as we'll talk about, then which was separate, but certainly in the colonial minds was seen in much the same way as another infringement, another restriction on movement, not to mention an encouragement of French Catholics over colonial Protestants. All of these things, I think, just for a colonist, made them think of these pretty instantaneously as intolerable acts. Although I'm not exactly sure when they were referred to by that name.
Yeah, I would agree with Todd that I think it's pretty much from the moment they get news, right, that we start to see them referred to that way. And I think it's just a rhetorical ploy to turn the idea of the Coercive Acts, which, nobody wants to be coerced, and then to sort of spin off of that and say, this is a tyrannical, arbitrary use of power, right? This is a little bit later in the conflict, but when Jefferson writes his summary view of the rights of British North America, he actually describes them as acts of power, and then goes on to riff on how that differs from acts of legislation, true acts of governance, that these are unconstitutional and so forth. So I think it's just the idea that that they were intended to be coercive, that they were not, the acts consented to by the people themselves, that gives them that label.
Did the British refer to them as the Coercive Acts? Is that how, does anybody know that they lumped them together, or was that also, I've heard them called both, of course, right?
Yeah, I think the British refer to them as the Coercive Acts because this was a response, and this does a couple of things we want to talk about today. I think the passage of these acts by the British suggest very, very clearly that hardliners are now in control in Parliament, and they're the ones driving British policy, because a number of people in Great Britain believe that the British have been way too lenient toward the colonies. Every protest over the Stamp Act or the Townsend duties or things like that led to a removal of the acts or a lessening of the duties and responsibilities, and they believe the colonists were getting away with murder almost. So these were designed to send a message, particularly to Boston, for the punishment of obviously throwing the tea in the harbor, the destruction of the tea in December of 1773, and they were designed to coerce them back to being lawful British subjects again. So I think the coercive nature of this was very, very intentional on the part of the British, because they essentially were saying, we've let these guys get away with way too much, we've been way too lenient, and now we have to go very far in the other direction. And that's clearly what these acts were, and how the colonists understood them to be. I mean, they understood them as being very coercive, and in their minds, of course, they were intolerable, but they were designed to be coercive by the British.
Yeah, even somebody as supportive of the American cause as Edmund Burke, right? I mean, following the tea incident, to use that term, he says we have to take action, and he's supportive of this passage, this combined bill, if you will.
Oh, I didn't know that. So Burke was in favor of these. Yeah, and he was quite conciliatory in some ways toward the
right.
Toward at least reconciling, trying to find ways to reconcile the colonists with Britain. But okay, so Todd, you mentioned the fact that well, first of all, just a couple of things. A lot of these acts, as you point out, they seem clearly aimed at the Massachusetts sort of movements that had taken place recently. You mentioned the Boston Tea Party, a lot of the other things that have been taking place in Boston and in Massachusetts. So perhaps the Quebec Act, we can set that aside a little bit, but the other acts that are bundled together as the Coercive Acts really do seem to be aiming at getting grips on the situation in Massachusetts primarily, although I don't know that that's simply the case, but I can see why the people of Massachusetts saw this as directly aimed at them, which also makes me think perhaps Sam Adams and his band of patriots probably had a pretty strong hand in immediately labeling these as the Intolerable Acts. But what I'm really interested in is the changes, as you mentioned, that had taken place on the side of the British, because as we all know, there were a series of acts stretching all the way back into the early 1760s, which Americans they didn't find them tolerable because they protested, and of course the British eventually backed off on a lot of them. But they didn't think of them as intolerable necessarily, or they didn't call them the Intolerable Acts. And yet the British did back off. Correct me if I'm wrong about my history here, but they did back off on some of those earlier acts. So can we talk a little bit about the political dynamics that had changed between, say, the 1760s and into the 1770s, both perhaps on the American side and the British side?
Yeah, well, I think the British are, from 1765, the issuance of the Stamp Act, which was repealed then a year later, the British sort of cycled through a number of different prime ministers, Grenville and Townsend, and then others come on board. There are various shifting factions in Parliament and in the larger British sort of intellectual political world who are debating how best to deal with the colonists, how best to deal with these protests. And for a variety of reasons, either because they didn't work in the case of the Stamp Act, which simply did not raise revenue, or because they were being not as helpful or not as productive in terms of helping to generate revenue for Great Britain with the Townsend duties, the British repealed a lot of those measures and acts. But one of the clear differences here, I think, is, as I said, the hardliners are now in charge. They're the ones driving policy. And now these acts are not designed to raise revenue, and they're not designed to help pay down the debt or get the colonists to pay their fair share of things. These are clearly designed to be punitive acts and punitive measures. And so there's a big difference, I think, between the Stamp Act of 1765, which, when it was repealed, brought in a year of relative calm until the Townshend duties. And then those were repealed, except the one on tea in 1770. And that brought in a period of calm, which lasted for several years until the Tea Act, which, again, as we may talk more about, was designed to raise revenue for the British, but also raise revenue for the East India Company in particular, and prop up a major British corporation, British company that was struggling. So this was, in some ways, I guess, one of the early bailouts, we might call it. That's what we would talk about today in terms of bailing out a company, or too big to fail in some ways. And the East India Company was arguably that. But the Tea Act was then protested, obviously, by the destruction of the tea, which later came to be known as the Boston Tea Party. And the response to that, and these coercive acts, are all plainly coercive. This is to punish, it's to discipline, it's to enforce British law. And I think that reflects just how far British policy has moved, not only away from let's raise revenue to let's punish these people. It also reflects the various changes in British leaders over the time and who's got the most powerful voices. And the most powerful voices by 1773, 4, and 5, actually on both sides of the Atlantic, you could argue, are the hardliners. The hardliners in Great Britain who say, let's punish the colonists, and the hardliners and the colonists who say, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if we declared independence and went our own way. We need to protest this. So I think we see a sort of polarization on both sides of the Atlantic. And I think that has been a gradual movement from, the Stamp Act could be excused as, well, it's a misunderstanding. The British didn't understand our rights and we told them, and then they repealed it. And I think those misunderstandings eventually gave way to both sides digging in.
So if I could just jump in and sort of spin on that a little bit, I think that we see the policies become more and more hardline, but actually, the repeal of the Stamp Act is followed immediately by the issuance of the Declaratory Act, right? And
Right.
so all of these later activities, including, I think, especially the Coercive Acts or the Intolerable Acts, are really in the shadow of that 1776 piece of legislation, which says that Parliament has the right to legislate for all the colonies in all cases whatsoever, right? So even though the Stamp Act is a protest over taxation without representation, when it's repealed with this sort of caveat that, well, we're being gracious in, taking away this troublesome act, but we're making a statement that we have absolute power over you. And that statement continues to be in the background of all this other legislation. And that's, I think, what really infuriates the colonists, right? It's not the trouble to their purse or the manipulation of, well, this is a regulation, not a tax, all of that. It's this lingering thought in the background that Parliament has absolute authority. And the threat to then, like the charters, as we see ultimately, do get amended and changed in the Massachusetts Government Act, all of that is sort of in the background, and people like Sam Adams are trying to keep that at the forefront of the conversation, even in those, relatively quiet periods where there's not a lot happening. He's sort of like, well, wait, they've still said this. They've never backed off of this idea.
And he ends up being proven right then, right? Apparently, with the Coercive Acts. Were the Declaratory Acts, Sarah, do you know where was it in 67?
66.
66?
Yeah, Sarah's right. It's
66,
March 18th, 1766 is the same day Parliament repeals the Stamp Act with the one hand, they issue the Declaratory Act with the other. And many colonists think that's kind of window dressing or kind of, cover to give them a kind of an escape hatch. When in fact Parliament clearly meant that, and the colonists would discover that in time.
Yeah, so we're talking about 8 years later. I mean, the Coercive Acts are really sort of just building on the authority that was asserted by Parliament in the Declaratory, right? So, But I didn't know that about Sam Adams, Sarah, as you were saying, that he was I think, did you describe it as a period of relative lull or inactivity, or periods of inactivity where there were no major acts of parliament coming out to remind colonists that they were subject to oppression, but Sam Adams and others were constantly reminding them that, hey, this is coming because of the Declaratory Act, and trying to remind them that they did in fact say that. So were people, I guess I'm wondering, do you have any sense whether people were surprised by the Coercive Acts, or didn't they have some sort of expectation that in light of some of their activities that these must have been some, sort of expected?
Well, I mean, I don't know. It's always difficult, right, to take one source and say how widespread that is. But there's a series of pamphlets that were sermons and then published, as pamphlets that have comments from various ministers in the Boston area. And they're after the fact, they're after the Coercive Acts have been passed, but in their in discussing them, they make reference to, hey, we told you this was coming, right? You shouldn't be surprised. This is the sort of thing that Great Britain has been moving towards because of its other policies, right? So even during the period of relative quiet under Lord North, who's generally viewed by historians as, somewhat more sensitive to the American situation, he's actually using the revenue that is being raised by the Tea Act to take the power of the purse away from the colonial legislatures, and so that the governors and then justices of the peace and stuff will be paid directly by the crown, right? So then they'll be more dependent on the British imperial government than they are on the local colonists, right? And so that's something that's happening during those periods of calm that Adams and other sort of rabble-rousers are pointing to, saying, hey, this isn't an action without consequence, right? And it is all part of a design that we should be leery of.
Yeah, that's very interesting. That points me to, we've got a number of really good questions coming in from people who are joining us. And that reminds me of two of them. One of them has to do with Larry's curious regarding the general feeling of the populace concerning these acts. He says, obviously, we see how the elite felt. I guess the ones you're referring to as the hardliners, right? Sam Adams and others that are trying to push this thing in a certain direction. But Larry's curious about how the general populace felt about these things. And then on the flip side, there's another related question from Chris. How did the loyalists in Massachusetts reconcile their feelings of loyalty to the crown with the anger of feelings about losing their sense of fundamental rights and freedoms? So a couple of interesting questions about just sort of the general population, not necessarily those who are involved in the leading the movement, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that it's always hard, as Sarah noted, to gauge how widely these things are felt, and without opinion polling and things like that, it's hard to know how many people are involved or what percentage of the public felt this way or that way. But these acts were so widely detested and seen as an affront and as being completely intolerable by colonists up and down the seaboard. They were directed at Boston, clearly, and in Massachusetts more largely, but that was intended to send a message to the other colonists and to make an example of Boston. And I think Parliament believed that they didn't need to make these widespread, because making an example of Boston would hopefully bring other colonists back in line by showing them how serious the British were and how forceful they were about this. But in terms of how the colonists responded, I think and we can talk about this later when we get to the Continental Association and that document, by organizing these committees, these inspection committees, by organizing boycotts, which have been tried before and were partially successful, the widespread way in which this happened and the strong support for that, I think makes it very clear that this was more than just a few elites, whether rabble-rousers or Sons of Liberty types or the people who wrote pamphlets and held positions. These were pretty widely spread and felt, because these related to everyone, and they connected to basic acts that everyone would be affected by. Closing the port of Boston would affect everybody, of whatever social class, of whatever political inclination. Shutting down the Massachusetts Government Act, restricting its meetings and saying that you can only deal with essentially local issues. We don't want any more petitions about freedom and liberty and these kinds of things. That's, again, a real affront and an attack on a practice of democratic self-government that Massachusetts had really only known since the start. So I think these were the kinds of things that were designed to hit broadly, and they did. And that's, I mean, we can see that as another miscalculation on the part of the British in the bigger picture. But I think at the time, certainly, these were the kinds of things that really did affect widespread numbers of colonists and led to widespread support for these measures, calling in the Continental Congress, et cetera.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And we can even see that, and again, we can talk more about this later, in the Continental Association articles, some of the specific clauses don't relate to the Coercive Acts, right? The clause number 2 about the importation of slaves, right? That has nothing to do with the Coercive Acts per se, but it's really a response of the Southern colonies who had been trying to pass legislation on their own during the 1760s and early 1770s to stop the importation of slaves, not necessarily for principled reasons, but so that they could then sell their own slaves to the colonies further south and make a profit that way. And the king had been blocking those pieces of legislation, right? So whether you're in Massachusetts or not, Parliament has been interfering with what's understood as local affairs and rights of self-governance. And so I think that it is more widespread than just a few, angry men up in Boston.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's always struck me as really interesting how this, again, you're both pointing out nicely here that an important effect of the Coercive Acts, that it really, in a way, galvanizes other colonies like Virginia, right? Which moves, I think, perhaps more quickly than some other more southern colonies toward the cause of independence eventually, right? But certainly resistance. I think it's shortly before or just after these acts that I could be wrong about this, but I think it's just about this time that Virginia starts setting up committees of correspondence. I think it's actually 1772, so it's probably before the Coercive Acts. But Virginia seems to be moving toward the idea of feeling a kind of common cause with Massachusetts. Not to say that wasn't there before. Certainly after the Coercive Acts, they start to identify more and more with a common cause on behalf of all the colonies. So am I overplaying the importance of the Coercive Acts in bringing about this sense of unity among the colonies that eventually, as we know, led to a Declaration of Independence and a unified resistance to the British, or not?
Well, I don't think so, because I think you're right. That does give all the colonists, again, this grievance, because although it's directed at one, the clear implication is Great Britain could do this to any colony and come in and close down its legislative body or set restrictions on its ports or things like that. And I think it does. I mean, there had been clearly elements of cooperation previously and of correspondence. That was a critical development in the process of the revolutionary movement. But now I think anyone who doubted the seriousness of the situation would have a very difficult time holding that position after the Coercive Acts. And I think this gets back to the question that I think it was Chris had asked about the loyalists. I mean, part of what happens is loyalists by this point sort of are beginning to leave or go underground in some ways, because their positions now are becoming extremely unpopular with many people, and they're becoming targets of abuse and everything else. And I think for many who were loyal, this is one of those measures that they have to try to reconcile. And probably, since people were often going back and forth or moving from one camp to another, probably, and there's no way to know numbers or percentages, but this was the sort of thing that may have moved some people who were leaning toward sympathy for the British position to move toward sympathy for the colonial position. And I think all these kinds of changes in public opinion, these kinds of changes in cooperation between the colonies, these ideas of seeing the colonist as a unit, if not yet a nation, but as a unit of people yoked together with these shared principles, I think all these things were critical to get the calling of a Continental Congress to deal with these problems that could face an entire continent. And then ultimately that would lead, obviously, to independence and the creation of a new nation. So I think the Coercive Acts, Intolerable Acts are incredibly important for when they come, for what they do, and for the reaction that they provoke.
I see.
So 2 points, Todd, that you mentioned that just to sort of add on to. One is that this actually is what moves John Adams from being middle of the road. I think that the government has overstepped its bounds, but I'm not going to, be quite the public face of resistance that my cousin Sam is, to taking a more public role, and to being more assertive in his push for, towards revolutionary measures. So, somebody like Adams, who becomes such an important figure, this is like the final straw for him. And then also, in Pennsylvania, which is always kind of hard to predict and has such a strong conservative element through so much of the 1760s and the 1770s, it's the Coercive Acts that gets the population to sort of push back against that and to throw the Conservative Party out of the legislature, and to kind of put in the more radical element. So I think it's just that slippery slope argument that makes this such a compelling time for people.
That's very interesting, because I also recall that when they do, after the Articles of Association and they call the Continental Congress, Pennsylvania is represented there, but their delegation is pretty strongly divided over the questions of how much to resist, and whether we're aiming for reconciliation and eventually even, independence, right? Which the John Adams miniseries makes very very clear, very nicely, I think. But that's really interesting. But since, Sarah, you brought up John Adams, he's such an interesting and important figure in all of this. It reminds me of a letter that he wrote much later, which I know you're both aware of, his letter to Hezekiah Niles, where he's describing how this all sort of came about, how we had moved from being, sort of loyal colonists, loyal to the crown, to declaring independence. And he uses a phrase of, I think the phrase he uses is 13 clocks were made to strike in unison, or something to that effect. Am I frozen? I'm not sure if I'm. Can you hear me? I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Yeah, I hear you.
I'm sorry, somebody's frozen. But I think John Adams talks about how 13 clocks come to strike in unison at a certain point. And I like that line, because it seems to me that the colonies were so very different in so many ways, and yet somehow, as Adams points out, and the Coercive Acts seem to, again, have an important role in bringing these very different colonies together. But they're also very different in so many ways. And one of the things we've talked about is the idea that fundamental rights are being violated. Is it a kind of common understanding of what those rights are that eventually brings people from Virginia and Maryland and Pennsylvania and Massachusetts together? Is it because it certainly doesn't strike me as common economic interests. Or maybe it is, I'm not sure. I guess I'm trying to formulate a question out of this somehow, but.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. And let me just try to answer that by talking about one of the documents here, the Massachusetts Government Act, for example, which is when we read this, the language, it's a longer document, and the language can be kind of tough to get through. But when you look at this and what it does, this is a staggeringly aggressive piece of action by Great Britain. And what this does is say to Massachusetts, which has had from the beginning this long legacy of town meetings, which decided not only leaders and laws and policies, but which gave people voices for democratic consultation. That was a century and a half tradition that is now wiped away by this act. The Massachusetts Government Act disbands the legislature, sets back its times of meetings, changes the way members will be chosen for that, streamlines power in the hands of the royal governor and the British, and it also, again, restricts what can even be talked about. So it actually censors the content. If we take a look at Article 7, down toward the bottom of that, just picking out a few lines here, no meeting shall be called by the selectmen without the leave of the governor, in writing expressing the special business of the said meeting. So if anybody wanted to have a meeting, you would have to write and get permission to gather in the first place. You would have to explain what you wanted to talk about. And then it says very clearly, the meetings will only be, except for any meeting of the election of a representative or representatives in the general court, and that no other matter shall be treated at such meetings. So there's a restriction on debate, there's a restriction on conversation, there's a restriction on what can come up without getting prior authority. That is a tremendous restriction of not only what's been, what past practice has been, but it's clearly an affront that, again, makes this kind of thing intolerable. Who could agree to that? Who could agree to have an assembly that's only going to meet when the British say it's okay, or when the governor says it's okay? I mean, these are the kinds of things that I think are so restrictive that it cuts against that town meeting tradition and the right of self-government and self-rule, and does so in a way that clearly tilts really all the power toward the British or their officers in the North American colonies. So that is the kind of thing that I think any colonist could look at and say, this is just unacceptable. This is literally intolerable. We cannot abide by that. And if they try to force that on Massachusetts, they could do it to us as well. And so I think that cuts across any social distinctions, political distinctions, religious distinctions, and economic distinctions as well.
That's a great point, Todd. Is it true that there, virtually every colony or every colony did enjoy a large degree of self-government in that sense? I know, again, it's Massachusetts clearly does. They have that long tradition of self-government, and I know Virginia does as well. Is it true that all the colonies enjoyed that kind of self-government?
Well, in their own ways. I mean, I think each colony is a little bit different, certainly, and that's why these measures, these intolerable acts, are considered to be so excessive and so over the top in terms of what's permissible that they really find a way to offend and affect and change basically all the colonies. So the size of the colonial political involvement is different. The types of people involved is different from place to place, but it does clearly change and fire against a tradition that had been growing in some places. And the degree to which the various colonies have become democratized obviously differed, and the types of people chosen to office obviously differed. But this is the kind of thing that sort of cuts across, I think, cuts across all of that.
Well, I think especially because this 7th article is directed at local governance, right? So, I mean, all of the colonies, whether, how much self-government they have on the colony level certainly varies, but they all have sort of local town or, parish level governments that are threatened by this kind of thing, right? To say that even a regular town meeting to talk about fixing a road or, any kind of local issue has to be first okayed by the governor before we can even talk about it. I mean, that's really appalling at a level that, maybe if they had simply attacked the hierarchy, right? If they had simply gone after, well, we're going to make the governor's council no longer elected, but directly appointed by the king. If they had only done that, maybe it wouldn't have been quite so intolerable. But to go right to the heart of, even in your own communities, you're not going to be allowed to meet and gather and discuss freely, I think is what causes people to say, hold on, right? I think it really backfires to say we had this isolated, well, more or less isolated incident of violence, and the response is, let's rewrite the charter, let's get rid of self-government on even the most basic level. And I think the British thought, hey, if we have these draconian measures, maybe it'll turn people against those radicals in Boston, and they'll turn on them, and then they'll act more obliging towards the king. And instead, what it does is I think it radicalizes more of the population and puts them in sympathy with the hardliners in Boston.
Yeah, see, I have to wonder, and I don't know if there's any evidence or documentation to show what they were actually thinking, the British, in passing this. Did they not anticipate, were they so out of touch with sort of the colonial mind, the American colonial mind, that they didn't see the extent to which that the coercive acts would sort of snowball and unite in the sense that you're talking about? Did they just not predict that, or did they anticipate it and think they could just deal with it? Or, I mean, I have to wonder what's going through the minds of the British in all of this. And in fact, somebody submitted a question about whether either of you know how the British people viewed the coercive acts or even the intolerable acts, either way, and how they viewed the colonial response. I mean, I know we've talked about how the hardliners have taken over. I just, did they not, maybe this is unanswerable, but how could they not anticipate the response to this on the other side of the ocean?
Well, I mean, it's a classic case of unintended consequences, right? The British are trying to bring the colonists, as Sarah says, under control and finally reform these radical acts and protests and simply say, enough, no more. And it produces, obviously, the revolution and independence. So it's a classic case of unintended consequences. But I guess in some sense, and Sarah may know more about this, but I think in many senses, the British just really didn't care what the response would be. They just really didn't care how the colonists would see this. They were serious, and they believed that the colonists needed to be disciplined and ordered and controlled, and that's what these acts were designed to do. They did always believe in their overall superiority, militarily especially, that if push came to shove, they could easily handle an armed rebellion by the colonists. But I think they perhaps weren't even thinking about that. They just simply wanted to not only send a message, but to carry out some actions that would fundamentally eliminate the problem. Because again, for them, part of the problem is we have too many protest petitions, we have too many pamphlets, we have too many acts to try to tell us, the British, what our constitutional government should be about and things like that. We're tired of that. Where do these originate? Well, they originate in the houses in the assemblies of the colonies. Let's crack down on that. And let's also reinforce how serious we are by putting the entire colony at risk economically, by closing the port, which is, again, is a massively punitive measure. So, yeah, I think the British they've had it. I mean, to put it back in the sort of parent-child metaphor, which is sometimes how the disputes are talked about. This is a parent who's been tolerant, and now, you're never taking the car out again. You're grounded forever. You're sort of on house arrest here. You don't get an allowance. You can't talk on the phone. I want your iPhone. I mean, all these kinds of things. It's really a tremendous overreach. And I think there's so much anger and feeling on the part of the British of hostility that they just don't care what the reaction is.
Yeah, you prompted a question, Todd, from Andrea about how tightly controlled the press was in Great Britain. For example, did the Brits actually have any idea what the colonists were living under, as she puts it, or perhaps why they were, so concerned about these sorts of things? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if either of you know anything.
Well, generally, I think in the 1690s, I think the British press was sort of freed up, and you had the creation of what's called the Grub Street Press, which created a lot of outlets for satire and political criticism, and that carried over to the colonies as well. So you begin to see in newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic much more freedom of expression, much more ability to publish things. So there were always colonial positions being revealed. And as Sarah talked about before, there were a number of people in Great Britain, Burke the most prominent, who had always been rather sympathetic to the colonial position and said, well, they have a point, and believe that, except in the most violent cases, like with the destruction of the tea. So I think in many ways, the British newspapers were unrestricted, generally unpoliced in that sense, as were colonial newspapers, which again became part of the problem for the British.
Well, was there an attempt to increase censorship of the American or the press in the colonies under the Coercive Acts at all?
I don't think so.
Either,
but I think again the press was seen in many ways as a vehicle for the transmission of these dangerous ideas which were being debated in the assemblies. And so if you shut down the Massachusetts Assembly and cut off that kind of debate and try to restrict them to simply the nuts and bolts of small governing kinds of things, then maybe you don't have to worry about the publication of those ideas, publication of those various resolutions and stuff like that, because that had happened back in the Stamp Act protest as well, where these various colonial assemblies would debate and publish resolutions, and then they'd be circulated in newspapers and became far more widely spread.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, and I think Todd's right that the British just don't care at this point about what the colonial reaction will be. But I also think that they just have no idea how much has changed from 1765 to 1774 in terms of intercolonial correspondence, right? Those committees of correspondence really do change the way that the colonies think about their connections to one another, right? Previous attempts to act in unison, the boycotts had been only partially effective, right? Philadelphia signs on that they're going to boycott, and then Baltimore suddenly gets all their traffic, right? Because Maryland doesn't sign on because they're historically more loyal to the crown. And so I think the British kind of expected that it would be similar types of piecemeal, if anything, attempts at unity. And yet, because of those committees of correspondence, which kind of sidestep any sort of newspaper issues, right? We don't need to be printing reports about debates in the press. We can just send our own ideas back and forth. I think they just had no idea about the influence and impact of that sort of unofficial type of organization.
Oh, that's great. That's a great point. Yeah. So in the way that you're both talking about this, it's actually Nick just submitted a question that along the lines of something I was going to ask. It sounds like there's well, as Nick puts it, there's a kind of generational difference. He brings up what he calls the generational difference. For example, by the 1770s, you have probably a very large number of people living in the American colonies that were born in the colonies, and they therefore have a different kind of attitude. And as Nick puts it, they have no skin in the game in Great Britain, so to speak, right? Whereas the British, born in Great Britain, are loyal to the crown. They're born in Great Britain, and I think this raises an interesting point. Is part of this? Well, we know this is true, but to what extent were they really two different peoples? I guess is another big question, and I wonder. Because you read about how at least up until 1775, right around that time, a lot of American colonists are saying, look, we're British subjects and we're insisting on equal British rights, traditional British rights. And we're British subjects and those rights are being violated. I wonder the extent to which people living in Great Britain or people born in Great Britain actually thought of people living in the colonies as British. And I wonder if that didn't have an effect on this widening gulf as well. I don't know if either of you know how the British thought about Americans. Did they think of them as fellow citizens, as subjects?
There actually are, there's a fair number of sort of travelogue type publications at this time of people coming from England over to the colonies for one reason or another, and then going back to England and sort of writing accounts of their voyages to distant lands. And they comment a lot about how the colonies have differed from what they expected, particularly in even sort of word choices, right? So that maize is what the British call corn, is what the colonists call the same plant, right? And that bothers them. I mean, it's amazing to me the sort of like small details that these travelers point out and sort of go on about at length, that they feel like the colonies are becoming a place that's no longer British. And part of that is, the separation of time and distance, and then obviously the influence of other cultures coming and mixing and mingling in more cosmopolitan areas like New York and Philadelphia, less so in Boston, but that they just feel like they're losing some of that cultural connection to the colonies. And within the British government, there's some commentary that, okay, because of these cultural shifts, if we don't strengthen our imperial control by legislation, then they will eventually become independent. And they're concerned, obviously, to prevent that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because it seems like you could think of the Coercive Acts in one sense as meant to remind those American colonists that they are British, in the sense that they fall under the umbrella of the British Empire in a way, right?
Mm-hmm.
But Americans apparently didn't view it that way, or did they? Because again, you see these, as you point out, Sarah, these cultural shifts are in some ways subtle, but they seem to sort of accumulate to the point that by 1774, when the Coercive Acts come out, Americans or British subjects living in the American colonies, they seem to think of themselves only as British, in the sense that they share a common king with people living on the island of in Great Britain, right? And if that's the case, it seems to me that if it's at that point, you can't really have one British people when you're saying, well, we're only they're British in Britain and they're British in the American colonies, but we're only commonly British to the extent that we share a common king.
Mhm.
And once you reach that kind of political scenario, it seems to me that there may not be any chance of reconciliation, despite the attempts of some,
Mhm.
John Dickinson perhaps on this side and Edmund Burke on the other, to bring about that reconciliation.
Although it works for Canada and Australia even today.
Well, see, okay, there is hope, but you know,
Right.
that actually reemphasizes my point. There seems to be something else going on among these American colonies that makes that kind of reconciliation that you just described impossible. And I'm maybe throwing this question out. What do you think that is?
I mean, Todd might disagree, but I think it's the charters. I think the real fundamental difference is the fact that the colonies all had charters, whether they started as royal colonies or not. By this point, they all have charters from the king, guaranteeing that the rights of Englishmen will be enjoyed in the same way in the colonies that they would have been enjoyed in England, and that's really a shift in understanding takes place, I think, in England about what that means, so that Joe Blow living on the street in London understands his rights in 1774 differently than he would have in 1687 or 1689. But the colonists are still understanding them in this more 17th century way because of the charters. And so that this continual appeal to he's taking away our charter privileges, he's breaking these promises. If he can do that, what can't he do? I think is what sets them apart from the English on the island in great measure.
So
Yeah, I agree. I think Sarah makes a really good point, because up until 1765, really, with the Stamp Act, and maybe a little bit before that with the Proclamation Line of 1763, there had been very little reason for the colonists to worry much about these charters, because there was no attempt to take any rights away or define those rights for them or things like that. It's really only from 1765 forward that you get this debate within the empire over what it means to be in the British Empire. And gradually, as Sarah notes, the American colonists began to move away from that conception of being, just part of the British Empire with everyone else. And I think that's one of the critical importances of Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which underlines many of the themes that Chris had just pointed out about Americans beginning to get that sense of themselves. But I think even beyond that, and certainly that idea of American nationalism and American nationhood grows slowly and sort of indirectly. But I think even once they declare independence, the colonists are still faced with the situation of saying, well, okay, we're not British anymore, but what exactly does it mean to be American? I mean, one of those great questions. And there's a fascinating book by an historian named Carrie Ann Yokota that's called Unbecoming British, which has sort of multiple meanings, right? But I mean, part of the idea is, how did these colonists in North America unlearn British ways? How do they go about unbecoming British? And she argues that it's a long, drawn-out process, and that a lot of their identity after independence still remains shaped by the British precedent, the British colonial period, by British acts and forms and things like that, even as there are distinctly American aspects that grow out of that. So, there's not a clear, sharp break where it's like, okay, whatever came before is now gone. We're no longer British at all. They're Americans now, but so much of that American culture obviously had Anglican origins in that sense.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm sorry to bring Woodrow Wilson into this. I'm skipping ahead a century, but I remember a speech Woodrow Wilson gave. I think it was at Trenton, actually, a speech at Trenton, and he was talking about Washington's victory over the Hessians there at Trenton during the war. And Wilson made the claim that the American Revolution was not a revolution of principles. It was simply a revolution on behalf of American colonists to assert their Britishness. I'm paraphrasing quite a bit here, but what the Americans wanted was to above all remain British. And I think he's implying that by what he means by that is that there's something going on in the minds of Americans to the effect that, we never stopped being British. It's the British who stopped being British. We're just asserting traditional British rights here, and there's traditional British rights that are being violated, especially by the Coercive Acts. Do you think Wilson's right about that? I mean, it's a little of a weird abstract question. Is it, I never thought it was that simple because,
I
what do you think, Sarah? I don't know.
I think he's almost right. I think he'd be more right if what he said was they were trying to be English. Because people who study this time period from the other side of the Atlantic and look at the changes in English history following the Act of Union and the idea of a British Empire, when the British stopped being British or the English stopped being English, right? And so I think that Wilson is right in as far as it's those traditional rights of Englishmen that are being asserted. And I think that we see this in the Quebec Act. Sorry, you froze for a minute there.
No, yeah, sorry about
Okay.
that. I think my internet's doing weird things, but
Okay.
where do you see it? I'd love to. Yeah, where do you see this, Sarah? Please, I'd love to.
So in the Quebec Act, in the section, which is actually only the fourth section on the version that we have, when they
Sarah,
talk
can you say
about
that again? I'm
taking
sorry.
away the assembly, right, that it would be
Can you say where
inexpedient.
this is at?
It is at present. I'm sorry.
Sorry, can you say where this is at again? I think you
It-
froze up for a second.
Yes, it's section 12,
Okay, thanks.
which is the last section on the first page of the printout we have.
Thank you.
Yep. So it says it is at present inexpedient to call an assembly, be it therefore enacted that it will be lawful for His Majesty to constitute and appoint a council for the affairs of the province of Quebec, blah, 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 right? And in the commentary about this, the American pamphleteers make direct comparisons between this arbitrary setup of an unelected council and attempts in 1686 to create a similar structure in the Dominion of New England, right, under Edmund Andros. And they say, this is to establish a French government over English subjects, because by this point, there are already colonists who have moved following the end of the French and Indian War into the Quebec territory, which has now been enlarged, right, by virtue of the first part of this act, who will now be governed, one pamphleteer says, in the same arbitrary way that Frenchmen would be, right? How terrible to be governed like Frenchmen.
That's a great point. The problem of Canada, right? If I can just step back, it seems like the effect of the Quebec Act is that well, I guess I'm asking, how accurate is this? It's portrayed, I suspect, by Sam Adams types as a clear indication that the British are trying to surround the northern colonies, right, especially Massachusetts, with people who simply subscribe and support the idea of absolute monarchy or absolute submission to British authority, and they kind of spin. I mean, it may be true. I don't know. I'm asking, but they certainly portray it as another cog in that machinery of oppression that the British are laying out. Todd, I mean, are they right about that, or?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the Quebec Act was seen by the colonists rightly as an attempt to do a couple of things. First of all, to favor suddenly now French Catholics and extend, support and a bridge to them, surrounding them with people who are both, I guess, monarchist and papist. Those two things are a lethal combination in the eyes of many colonial Protestants. But what it also does, as Sarah notes, is it kind of attempts to restrict westward settlement by the colonists into those Great Lakes regions. And that cuts off access to trade, which affects economic livelihood. It cuts off access to settlement. And in Massachusetts, as many people know, those Massachusetts farms, as population grew, were being farmed and farmed and farmed to where the agricultural productivity from the same piece of land being farmed continually was really dissipating. And so the options for many people who couldn't inherit farmland or whose farmland was no longer productive was, well, let's move west. But this was an act that would seriously restrict that. So it affected not only small farmers, and this is another way in which it gets into a kind of cross-class affront to the colonists. It would not only affect small farmers looking to set up homesteads in the West, it also affected land speculators. It affected people who purchased those lands and wanted to turn around and resell them. So the Quebec Act is I think, an often underrated player in all of this. But it's also, for all the reasons that you and Sarah have talked about, I think it's right there front and center and was perceived by the colonists as yet another example of British tyranny.
Yeah, it's referred to in the Declaration, isn't it? I may be wrong about that, but they make a reference to something like this in one of the grievances of the Declaration. Perhaps I'd have to look it up. But,
yeah, I think so. I think that's right. And certainly the idea of that, of the British being able to do that and restrict westward settlement and things like that. I mean, partly that was, the proclamation line tried to do that and set that up as although it was designed to be temporary, also was perceived as a restriction on freedom of movement by the colonists. And that had been very upsetting in 1763. This is even worse because you're saying you can't go west. And by the way, you're now going to be surrounded with people who don't worship or subscribe to the same political views that you do.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I hadn't thought about that economic impact and those kinds of things that the Quebec Act actually had on people. So, but it's interesting. So okay, so the Americans are complaining about the Quebec Act in '74 and into '75, but shortly after declaring independence, we make an effort to bring the Canadians, the Quebecers, onto our side in the Revolution with an interesting appeal. Right, they send an emissary, and Congress drafts an appeal, a letter, and one of the things they argue in that I forget the exact title of the document. It's an appeal or a message to the French Canadians. They make an appeal to them on common political principles, which I always found odd because it seems to me they don't really share common political principles, or at least they didn't think they did 2 years earlier. And when I think this through, what this I guess is raising in my mind is, and I'm circling back a little bit to part of our earlier conversation about the growing divide or the gulf between the way Americans think and the way the English think, if to be more particular, as Sarah points out. I wonder how different they become in their political principles, because again, we know in 1774, for example, I don't think it was one of the required readings or suggested readings for today, but Jefferson in his I forget the title of the document, his Defense of the Rights of British Colonists, right, or Americans living in the British colonies. He makes the argument again that what we're really looking for are protections of traditional British rights. But again, I wonder the extent to which the way Americans thought about those rights had come to be very, very different from the way the British thought about traditional rights. You see both sides using the language, for example, of natural rights. Mm-hmm. But it seems to me that something has happened in the minds of American colonists that has either changed the way they think about traditional British rights / natural rights and the way people living in England think about natural rights. So I'm just wondering if either of you could say something about, just on a really fundamental political level, what are the real political differences in terms of principles that have emerged between the two sides here, and the extent to which that eventually affects the decision to declare independence, perhaps.
Well, just briefly, I guess what I would say is that I think we have a classic case here of two sides talking past each other, because they are both using the same language and they're using the same phrases, but those clearly don't come to mean the same things. And I think partly, maybe they never did mean the same things, but prior to 1765, there had just been so few opportunities to occasion this kind of thought about, well, what does this actually mean? What do we mean by these words? What does this phrase mean? What's the meaning of our charters, as Sarah talked about? What's the meaning of our place in the empire? These were questions that nobody really had to think much about prior to 1765 because there was so little need to do that. But in that decade from 1765 forward, there's a tremendous amount of thought on both sides of the Atlantic about rights and responsibilities, the meaning of citizenship, and these kinds of things, and what it means to be in the British Empire. And so what it comes down to basically is, I think this argument is ongoing, and they end up using the same words and language, but they use them to mean very different things, or they interpret them in very different ways. And I think ultimately, you could argue that it comes down to power. Who ultimately has power? Is it Parliament, as the British assert, or is it the colonial governments themselves, as the colonists assert? And the British are simply, they cannot back down and grant the colonial position that each colony can govern itself, or even that they could send representatives to Parliament, because from Parliament's mind, that's already taken care of. They legislate for the entire empire, as they had said back in the Declaratory Act that Sarah rightly brought up earlier. And the colonists cannot, part of the reason that these acts are intolerable is because these acts take away that fundamental part, that fundamental leg that the colonists have always stood on of self-government. And so the colonists now simply begin to argue that they cannot stay part of an empire that is going to deny them these fundamental rights and essentially take away all their power. So I think in many ways, as so many political questions do, to bring it back to the question that you asked, Chris, I think it does come down to power and different ideas about that, and the way that these different words are used and applied and thought about in that framework of where does the power ultimately lie.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I know you've both studied the charters and very carefully, and the colonial charters, and the British. So Todd, you just mentioned that the British Parliament is asserting that it has always had some kind of authority over the colonies, right? Mm-hmm. By the 1770s, you have the colonists saying, no, we only recognize the authority of the king, and not in any way that the Parliament having any kind of direct authority over the colonies. Mm-hmm. So how do we get to that point? What's that all about?
Well, yeah, and it's things on the English side of the Atlantic, right? That, in previous centuries, Parliament was always understood as the king in Parliament, right? So any action that Parliament would take was really on behalf of the king, or by his sufferance. And as a result of the English Civil War, and then the Glorious Revolution, Parliament has come to think of itself as a completely independent body. By the 18th notion, so that Parliament can actually make laws that are against even the traditional English, because of the Constitution of the Atlantic. And the Americans are saying that's not in any way what we understand a constitution to be, right? That's not our understanding of how the relationship between a legislature and a supreme law works. They still have this sort of 17th century idea that Parliament cannot make any law that goes against the British Constitution or natural law, like Edward Coke, had said in the 17th century. And the English have moved way past that in their understanding of Parliament's power.
That's fascinating. So in one sense, the Americans are operating on a pre-Glorious Revolution understanding of the role of king and Parliament, or the relationship of king and Parliament.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's really amazing. But it seems to me that on the other hand, there's an irony here in that the political principles that the Americans are leaning very heavily upon are principles that emerge largely from the Glorious Revolution in terms of the right of the importance of consent and the ability of the representatives of the people to actually kind of push back against the king. So,
well, I would argue that they actually predate the Glorious Revolution. Okay. That they really are more important in the civil wars of the sort of are brought back and reprised in the Glorious Revolution.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, Chris?
Please, yeah.
Yeah, could I just weigh in on just a couple of points I wanted to make here relative to this discussion we're having about British and American differences and things. I wanted to call our attention to the document we have, the Articles of Association of the Continental Association. This is October of 1774. I just wanted to point to a couple of things here that I find absolutely fascinating. And the first one is point number 8. this Continental Association. This is really, to my mind, fascinating because it calls, I mean, so many of these other 14 points refer to specific things about governments or committees and what they can do, and non-consumption agreements and correspondence and things like this. But number 8 really gets at the idea of trying to inculcate virtue among the colonists. And look how they're going to do this in number 8. We will, in our several stations, encourage frugality, economy, and industry, and promote agriculture, arts, and the manufactures of this country. So, you know, buy American, basically, is sort of, it's the first iteration, we could say, of that idea. We will discountenance and discourage every species of extravagance and dissipation, especially, and look at this list, horse racing, all kinds of gaming, cockfighting, exhibitions of shows, plays, and other expensive diversions and entertainments. And then it talks about funeral traditions, because these were very widely observed, particularly among upper classes, but some of this trickled down as well. No one will go into either any further mourning dress than a black crepe or a ribbon on the arm or hat, and will discontinue the giving of gloves and scarves at funerals. This is essentially saying, as part of this policy to assert our rights and privileges, we need to make sure that we are worthy of governing and governing well if it comes to governing ourselves. And we need to first of all look inward and make sure we are virtuous citizens who are behaving virtuously. So they're rejecting these kinds of things that would have, for some people, been real sacrifices, you know, to give up card playing and horse racing and gaming and cockfighting and these things. But they're doing this again as part of, I mean, I think it's fascinating that this idea is lodged in this document with so many other things that refer primarily to governing. And the second point I would make just briefly, in number 12, it sets up here these committees of correspondence will frequently inspect the entries of their custom houses. These committees of inspection and of correspondence really became, some historians have argued, a kind of shadow government for the colonies, because with the British not really present, and in the case of Massachusetts, their assembly basically disbanded, it's these committees that came to have great local power. And they're the ones who corresponded with each other. They're the ones who carried out local business. And I think that's a very important point to realize about this, is that there's I think, sort of a direct link from the colonial assemblies being under the control of the British to these committees of correspondence into the continental congresses, and then ultimately to the state governments that they would create after independence. It's a very important sort of way station or bridge, however you want to think of that. And I think those committees had tremendous power and also played a very important role as a kind of proto-government for the colonies before there was an American government.
No, that's fascinating. That last point, by the way, I know more about these committees of correspondence in Virginia than I do about in Massachusetts. But for example, I know in Virginia that not only did they create that kind of shadow government you were talking about in terms of promoting or maintaining a kind of commerce and these sorts of things in the absence of the British, but they also had punishments for those that violated the boycotts and actually did trade with the British rather than buying American, for example. I don't know if that was also the case in Massachusetts and some of the other colonies, but I know that was true in Virginia.
Yeah, and in fact, in number 5 of this Continental Association, they talk here about how people who violate this need to be publicized. It's sort of public shaming, right? I mean, this is an effort to sort of publicize the people who don't go along and are therefore not showing the kind of self-disciplined virtue that needs to be shown to make something like this work.
Yeah.
This is very Puritan, by the way, so, I'm sure that it worked in Massachusetts as well.
That's true.
Todd, can I ask you a question actually about number 8?
Yeah.
I think that you're right, that there's an underlying sense of we need to be the kind of people who can stick to these things. But there's also a practical element of, some of the activities that are being discountenanced, like plays and mourning dress. Some of those things would have required the importation of luxury items, right? And so by discouraging those activities, then it's easier to sort of keep the boycott going.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the same way I read that. That's what's going on, I think.
Okay.
But it could be both, right? I mean, it has a practical effect of discouraging the importation of certain British goods, but
Mhm.
But I was actually I was going to ask you this, Sarah, because I know you've done a lot of research on religious ideas during the colonial and revolutionary era, and I know you've read a lot of sermons. Do you see a shift in sort of the moral tone? We've talked a little bit about the shift in the. You talked a little bit about the shift in the political tone of sermons. Did you see any kind of shift in the sort of moral tone of sermons in terms of pushing for certain kinds of perhaps American virtues in the kinds of sermons or religious documents of this period?
Oh, that's interesting.
I know
American
that's a big
virtue.
question, and we're toward the end of our time, and I hate to drop that on you, but
Yeah. I mean, I think Todd is right that there's certainly now a practical prudential reason for people to behave virtuously, right? So that I think it becomes easier for a lot of the clergy to expound on these themes without sounding um, that they can now couch calls to virtue in a more practical, like this will benefit you in the now, not just in the hereafter. And so I think you see that kind of shift, that some of the arguments in favor of the virtues become a little bit more pragmatic. But yeah, I'll leave it there because of the time.
no, that's interesting. So, I mean, I'd be interested to hear more, have a conversation with you about this in the future at some point about whether they were able to sort of wrap their calls, the preachers could wrap their calls for virtues in a more patriotic garb, so to speak. But be interested to push this even further. We've had a lot, again, a lot of good questions, and I haven't gotten to all of them. There are a lot of them that I think would be worth pursuing further if we had more time. But one of a couple of the questions that were submitted had to do with sort of the effect of the coercive acts in particular on say the Declaration and our own sort of future political aspirations. So I think you both have done a great job of pointing out how sort of the immediate effects and consequences of the coercive acts on pushing the colonies toward a greater unity and towards perhaps independence. Do you see in future developments, political developments, either in the Declaration of Independence or even perhaps skipping ahead to the U.S. Constitution, the influence of the coercive acts or any of the other things that we've been talking about?
Well, I do. I mean, I think in many ways, if you look at, for example, Pauline Mayer's study of the Declaration of Independence and the local declarations that came from various communities, so many of those were inspired by the coercive acts. And when they list their grievances and send these to the Continental Congress, the grievances they list are really very recent in time to when they're writing these. And the immediate frame of reference for most of those would be these coercive acts. So I think there is very clearly, because those local documents obviously give us a good sense of how people think more broadly, but they also become, clearly part of what Jefferson famously expresses in the Declaration. So I think there is a direct link between those, and it's clearly what is on people's minds. And that's one of the reasons why the Declaration takes so much time to spell out, rights and liberties, and also the infringements of the king on those rights and liberties.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, I think sorry, go ahead, Chris.
No, please go ahead, Sarah.
Okay, I think that the Administration of Justice Act, the idea that an official might be accused even of murder, but then not tried in the location where the crime was committed, not tried by a jury of his peers. Yeah. And there were other, acts that weren't in today's readings related to jury trials and the removal of people from locations. I mean, that's clearly something that gets enshrined in the Declaration and then in the Constitution. And, I think it's still an important part of how we understand our civic duty today, right? That everybody bemoans being called to serve on a jury, and yet I don't think anybody would prefer, that we switch to a system of professional jurors or non-jury trials.
Yeah, right. Everybody bemoans it, but me, I've always wanted to serve on a jury, but I always get dismissed. As soon as they find out I'm a college professor of political science, they just. Well, we have come to the end of our time, and I feel like there's a lot more that can be said about this. Obviously, you both are very knowledgeable on this, and I think we've dug pretty nicely into this, but if I know you both have taught courses in our MAG program on the American Revolution, or courses having to do with American colonies and things like that. So perhaps some people who haven't had the opportunity to take a MAG course would be interested in having these conversations further with both of you. And I really do appreciate your time and thoughts in trying to frame this, the significance of the Coercive Acts, both historically and politically. So as always, I've learned a great deal, and I thank you both very much.
Do we have time for one more quick point or not?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Just a quick thing about the Quartering Act, because this is the kind of thing that probably for many of the teachers who are listening today, I had to change my lecture notes when I read this more closely myself. The Quartering Act is usually taught as the kind of thing that gave British troops the right to come to a house and lodge themselves in a private house. That's actually not what it does, though. I mean, the key thing about the Quartering Act is that it says uninhabited houses or buildings or outhouses or things like that. So that was offensive enough, because it meant that you were supposed to provide a housing for the British troops, and if it wasn't large enough or wasn't close enough to town or wasn't deemed appropriate by the British, they could go claim other buildings. But it actually does not extend to private homes and houses, so they couldn't go up to someone's door of a private dwelling and say, "We're here, get out." So that's one of the things about the Quartering Act that I think is sort of misunderstood.
Yeah.
And I, for years, didn't know that myself. But I think that's one of the takeaways that we might have, that again, is an interesting point to bring up, that sort of may change the way many of us, myself included, have to teach this now.
Yeah. Well, what were they complaining about then, right? I mean, if it's just uninhabited residences, I'm partly joking. But it also shows, Todd, how that uninhabited part probably got overlooked because partly of the way that, Sons of Liberty and committees of correspondence wanted to spin this for political reasons, for their own agenda. But also because, once the passions get worked up, sometimes people overlook the details, and well, as Edmund Burke, since Sarah brought up Edmund Burke earlier in our talk, Edmund Burke in his one of his speeches to Parliament, trying to explain why these Americans are so fanatical about liberty and self-government. One of the things he says is they smell tyranny around every corner. They smell it, right? So yeah, that sometimes the details get lost when you you think that every little
the
thing.
soldiers were in the barn, so then they smell when
there you go, exactly.
Perfect. Well, again, just another example, Todd. I'm glad you brought that up, but another example of how much more there is to get out of these great documents in future conversations. So hopefully we'll have you both back, and we can continue this at some future time, either in a MAG course or in another webinar. So
that would be fun.
Definitely.
Thank you both very much. I really learned a lot and enjoyed this very much. So
thank you.
And I'll just remind our participants again, thank you for your great questions. They really help the conversation. And also remind you about the email you'll receive with the link for your certificate of participation. Our next Saturday webinar will be 2 weeks from now, I believe, September 9th. And we're fast forwarding to the election of 1800. So we'll see how this relates to that, perhaps. And we'll be joined by Stephen Knott of the United States Naval War College and Jeremy Bailey of the University of Houston. I hope to see you all then. Until then, take care. Thanks for joining us. And Todd and Sarah, thanks again. That was